Well, I would have to say that my first insight into the principles happened before I heard Sid speak about principles, but hearing him speak about principles really put what happened to me into a context that I could understand and share. So my first insight happened in 1985 during the first time I heard Sid speak. And if you want to know what my life was like before that, I mean, it wasn't terrible, awful, but I thought it was. And you know how a picture is worth 1,000 words? Well, I have one for you. I happened to be an art teacher who was learning to provide art therapy in hospitals and schools. And this was a self-portrait at the time. Oh my goodness. Not something to laugh at, although, I mean, now, it just looks so dramatic. And there was a lot of, how should I say, influence around me to be as expressive as possible. It was an expressive arts program, which is wonderful to express oneself. But it was almost as though, at least the way I experienced it, that the more gruesome you could be, or the more shining the light on what is negative and uncomfortable without a recognition that we're creating that. So I'm sitting in my first talk of Sid's, a small group of people back then, and I can't tell you what I heard, but I could tell you what happened. It's pretty extreme, actually. I had a big cry that was relief in capital letters, like I had never experienced. I did not realize up to that point that I was carrying such a burden on my shoulders that I had to create a life that would be satisfying and fulfilling, that it was all up to me. And then what happened through the years is that my life got created without me meddling, unbeknownst to, it's interesting to look in retrospect, because that's when you see through the filter of the principles. I'm not finding the exact word, but through that paradigm, that would be the word. Looking at my life experience, how my life changed. I was going to be an art therapist until I got so disheartened when we were being taught to diagnose people. They believed in what they called the medical model, and they thought, when I say they, my particular teachers, maybe it's taught differently now, but I don't know. But back then, they would use imagery, like artwork, in order to diagnose somebody. Yes, it's true. It's one thing to give somebody a Rorschach's test, where you can see if they have depressing elements, but they were actually, depressing thoughts. But they would actually say that if a child drew that black circle in a tree trunk, it meant that child was sexually abused. And I know I was not sexually abused, but I used to draw black circles and tree trunks because I copied other kids. I mean, so the thought was, to me, horrifying that I would be diagnosing children, people of all ages, through artwork, and that label could stick with them for life and have negative consequences for that person's life. So the timing couldn't be any better, that I would be brought to a talk by Sid Banks and hear enough to know that there was something there to pay attention to. So back then we didn't have videos and webinars and podcasts. We had trains, planes, and automobiles, and that's how we got to wherever Sid was speaking. So if you're new to this approach, lucky you, it's brought to you in your living room now. And so the trajectory of my life really, really changed. Up to that point, I had thought that my happiness was dependent upon my finding the right man to marry, have babies, have the right house, and the proper fence. I'm just reflecting on how absurd all of that is. But at the time, it was my reality. It was not absurd. It was the reality, not just of me, but friends of mine and people I grew up with. So I can't be more grateful. There is no word to express my level of gratitude, because I have never felt, certainly not as depressed as that drawing, but honestly, I have had moments of sadness, but they're always attributed to personal thinking, always. Oh, I mean, of course, I'm sad to hear about terrible things going on in the world, but I'm quick to notice that if there's something I can do about it, have at it. Do something if it's going to be constructive. But, the best thing I can do for these awful things happening in the world, I have seen, is to share my understanding with people who are curious and want to know about it, and to keep my state of mind as elevated as possible. That's going to do more for other people I come in contact with. And how do I see the field of mental health changing? It's already changed through the 30 plus years that I've been around this, where our conferences numbered less than 100. And now we can go to a conference that has 1,000 people in a sports center, with many, many more streaming that conference throughout the world. So it's the impact has been enormous. And we all keep learning and going deeper together. So I know that my practice as a counselor, a therapist, a mentor, I like that designation best, because I'm just sharing what I've come to see. And that has evolved through the years. There's no question about it. So the ramifications are enormous for the whole world. And we're 50 years, we're getting pretty close to having a critical mass of people see that their reality is being created from within them. It's not something to rail against or someone to fight with out in the world. It's coming to an understanding through your ability to see how your life unfolds. When we see that, there's no argument. We know that life is unfolding through how we're perceiving things. It's obvious, but it wasn't obvious before my first insight. It was not at all obvious because nobody ever shared that with me, for one thing. And even if they did, until I had my own insight, it would not make an impact. So hang in there. If you are listening to this, you're on the road to, if you haven't already experienced a beautiful insight and more to come, then you will. It's bound to happen. So I'm just so grateful, and that we're able to share something that started with one single person on the planet. Okay,